Well, good morning and welcome from London. I'm here today with an old friend, Doug McWilliams, who's the Deputy Chairman of the Center for Economics and Business Research. And we're here today to explore a subject I find absolutely fascinating, how to create a knowledge city, evidence from London's flat white economy. Now, Doug was with us last year where he used the excuse of a rally with his brother to take us on an economic tour across Asia and the Silk Road. But today we're going to look a lot closer to home. Many of you will know Doug's book on London, on the flat white economy, and we're going to be touching on that, but really very much with its applicability to London. Now, you'll know me, I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm one of the directors of Yen, but over these past almost 2 years, I've also had the privilege of being a sheriff of the City of London. And part of that role, a major part of that role, is promoting London around the world. And so I too, particularly post-pandemic, am going to be fascinated at learning from Doug and what his insights are and the directions that he can give about how we can make our knowledge city even stronger. And our knowledge city is also strong because our sponsors allow us to range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance. And today we're going to see the confluence of all three of those. Now, the format today is for me to get out of the way as quickly as possible so you can hear from our expert. Doug will be speaking for about 20 minutes, and there are a couple of polls, so keep your fingers on your buzzers, please. When Doug is finished, I'll be feeding comments, questions, observations from you into a conversation with him, and we'll end at approximately quarter to noon. 3 points of housekeeping, if I may. Firstly, the slides are already available on the website, and you can go through them as we're here. Secondly, yes, this is being recorded, and the recording will be up in approximately 2 working days, so Wednesday afternoon, I would assume. And finally, on the Q&A, I'm here with you. I'm not on Signal, Zoom, email, messaging, WhatsApp. I am here with you. So please do use the GoToWebinar question and answer facility to send questions in to Doug, and I'll feed them in. All the questions, comments, and observations that you make will be sent to Doug, and it will be sent with your email so he can respond to you directly if you wanted to ask him some point of detail or some substantiation of anything. So please do feed those comments, questions, and observations in. And I guess that covers the housekeeping. So with no further ado, Doug, the floor is yours.
Michael, thank you so very much. And it's so nice to be back with you. I'm very appreciative of ZN and your contribution to life, and particularly your contribution to the FS Club, which I think has produced a series of quite fascinating webinars. And I'm privileged to be invited to join for a second time. I don't know whether that's a record or not, but I'm very grateful indeed. Next slide, please. What I want to do is build on the work that I did for my book, The Flat White Economy, and try and turn it into a research tool that we can use to try and promote economic development in our cities and elsewhere, in this country and abroad. Next slide, please. The key thing about a knowledge city is, in my view, it turns the process of economic development on its head. Traditionally, economic development has been about attracting capital, attracting investors, and so all sorts of exciting offers have been made to attract it. What the knowledge city approach based on the flat white economy suggests is actually we should look at it the other way around, because demand for knowledge-based products is already established. The technology is either available out there or it can be created. And one of the huge changes, particularly since the financial crisis, but even from earlier, is that we're in a low yield environment, and we're in an environment where governments print money. What that means is it's relatively easy to attract capital. And so what I'm arguing is that the scarce factor that you need to try to drive knowledge-based urban development is not capital, but it's people and its skills. Next slide, please. So the critical issue is how to build, retain, and attract knowledge city skills. Next slide, please. So this is your first poll. I ask a series of questions, and we'll repeat the questions after the talk to see if people's views have changed.
So I've just launched that poll, Doug. Folks, which do you think will do most to help the UK create more knowledge cities? Is it tax relief, better cycle lanes and transport, music venues and art centres, world-class universities, or streamlined and cheap visas for talented migrants? As ever, Doug, we're not even 15 seconds in and over half the audience have voted. I'm just going to leave it open a little bit longer to get the numbers up. Well over 65% now, 70%. As you can tell,
you don't get the right to vote.
Yeah, we're very opinionated. No, we're not allowed to vote, Doug. Sorry about that. Okay, and I'm closing the poll with the vast majority of folks having voted. And as you can see, it's a toss-up really between world-class universities at 36% or streamlined and cheap visas for talented migrants at 36%, with tax reliefs and music venues and finally cycle lanes running very distantly behind that. Okay, so
well, maybe some of those things will change, but let's go through what I have to say, because as I say, I'm looking at it from a very different point of view. Our concept is a virtuous circle where all the good things reinforce themselves. So we'll start on the red side of this chart, which shows investment in placemaking, and that's making the place really attractive to people, sustainable transport, housing, skills, culture, that sort of stuff. It also talks about social cohesion, and I'll come to that in a bit more detail. But there is very much amongst the sort of people that you're trying to attract a desire for social cohesion. And I believe that unless urban regeneration takes this into account, we won't be as successful as we could be at attracting as many people as we would want to attract. But all these lead to getting people coming in. You get a more competitive location, you get higher quality of life, you attract and retain skilled labor, you get higher business investment, more economic opportunities, faster population growth, and on the whole, the circle is virtuous. There are some bits where you can be success can lead to failure if you create excessive congestion, if property becomes too expensive, etc. But by and large, these places that start being successful become more so. And that seems to be the evidence, especially from London and from the flat white economy. Next slide, please. Now, I've talked about the flat white economy, and it's probably worth just picking up what it actually is. And the people in my office have got a statistical definition, which is media, information, and communications. A lot of people in government talk about digital, but what they miss is a lot of the skills that people actually want in this new economy, website designers and so on, are essentially creative. And it's no surprise that where the flat white economy first developed was in the creative part of London. At one point in Hackney, they had more artists per square kilometre than anywhere else in the world. And East London's film industry has had a lot to do with building up the technical skills that have then led to it becoming the still favoured location, and actually still the most favoured in the world, for producing digital things as well. They fit very well together. But the technical definition of the flat white economy is to include software, computer programming consultancy, you would expect that, data processing and websites. Well, websites are more creative, so just be aware of that. Other information services, Bloomberg is obviously the prime example, but advertising and market research are now about 80% digital, and they have become part of the digital economy. Television and film post-production, a lot of that happens, and it links very closely with the digital world. So it's the merge of the digital and the creative sectors. Next slide, please. The knowledge city, sorry, can we move on? Thank you. The knowledge city is an extension of that. Now, this is just a bit of cod econometrics, and if you've done enough econometrics, you know how to use it to prove virtually anything. They say if you torture the data for long enough, it will reveal any secret you want it to reveal. And what this is we looked at the density of flat white economy jobs, and we looked at the density of independent coffee shops. And as you can see, there's a relationship which is surprisingly close. It's the R squared was about 80-something%, which, you know, it's hard to get that in real life because real life is messy. And that partly reflects the title of the book, because the title of the book is trying to define the people in this economy by lifestyle, not by occupation, because we think you're trying to recruit a certain type of person who can make a contribution in a certain way. And actually, if you look at other areas of the knowledge economy that go beyond digital, they are looking at recruiting very similar people, highly skilled, highly technical people, highly technically competent people. And it's more about psychology attracting them than just simply economics. Next slide, please. Now, this is the first of my sort of quite bold statements, which is that I reckon that the flat white economy might not have happened, or not have happened so well, had they not set up the euro. Because when they set up the euro, as most of you can recall from 2010 to 2012, they created an economic crisis eventually in pretty well the whole of the Mediterranean part of the EU. They've sort of survived it, but Italy has still had no economic growth in this entire century. And Greece has still got very high unemployment, although the Greek economy is now recovering, as is the Portuguese economy. And of course, Ireland also got hit by this, and got hit particularly by the financial crisis. As a result, and because most young people now speak English, and because of the fairly deregulated labour market in the UK, large numbers of people from these countries came to London and were looking for a job, just at the time that the flat white economy started to create jobs. And a disproportionate number of people working in the flat white economy still are from either Mediterranean Europe or else from Ireland. Next slide, please. And this brings me to what is the key observation, and it's the most important slide I'm going to show you, which is that immigration has a completely different relationship with economic growth from the conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom is that immigration boosts growth a bit because it helps the fiscal balance, because you've got people, someone else has paid for their education, and they come and most of them work. And most of them work in the formal economy, some work in the informal economy, most of them pay tax. They don't actually cost the public purse very much. And the traditional studies look at the tax expenditure balance. And that's certainly true. But that misses the key contribution of migrants. If you look at the Sunday Times Rich List, you will see that roughly half the people there are from abroad. Someone's written a book which claims that about a third of all UK economic growth since the 1960s has been caused by Asian migrants. Now, allocating growth It's a bit overdetermined, but it's still an interesting challenge. The way I look at it is this: immigration has a much bigger impact for three different reasons. The first is it removes, or at least relieves, skill bottlenecks, particularly in the creative economy. The second is an interesting one, but it's that immigration boosts creativity, because when people move out of their comfort zone, they become more creative. A lot of research amongst artists and musicians shows that. But they don't just boost the creativity of themselves, they boost the creativity of the people they're working with. And that is critical. And of course, creativity is the equivalent of coal and iron for the knowledge economy. Unless you've got creativity, you're nowhere. And the boost to that is also important. Thirdly, they boost profits. Now, profits can be either too high or too low. Normally in Western economies, they're probably below the optimal level. And I define the optimal level as the level that will lead to the fastest growth of consumption after adjusting, obviously, for time discounts and so on. At the moment, if everyone took a 10% wage cut, they would be earning more within 5 years in the West. There are countries where profits are too high. That's a different issue. But arguably, we set up a set of economic conditions that actually leave profits at a suboptimal level in terms of economic growth. Next slide, please. There's a big multiplier. And research that we did for Falmouth University on the creative sector demonstrates that. Next slide, please. As I said, attracting the right people is a matter of psychology, not really economics, although there are some economic elements. It's quite interesting just to look at the attitudes of the people you're trying to attract. They seem to be attitudes that thrive best in a world where there's a lot of vibrant political debate. There seems to be a link with freedom of expression, but it's worth noting that in some parts of the world, repression creates a sort of counterculture, which also creates freedom of expression. For example, it's the Russian flat white economy is remarkably successful, although the Chinese one is much less so proportionately. And arguably inefficient repression is quite a good way of creating a counterculture that creates a flat white economy. But I'm not arguing that people should go for that. So just thinking of their political attitudes does help you a little bit in thinking of some of the things that you might want to do to attract the people that you want to attract. Next slide, please. We think they believe very heavily in placemaking. Now, what is placemaking? It's a whole host of things. It's education, transport. But you'll see that the things at the bottom of this slide are all about making it fun. Now, just think of the sort of psychology of someone who sits in front of a computer all day. They may not get out that much. They may find difficulty in finding a partner. The thing that they desire most in their lives is something that guarantees them a reasonable amount of contact with people. And so culture, attractive environment, fun, sustainable, cool, these are all things that are particularly attractive to people who think that way. And in the past, as I say, people have built roads, built infrastructure. I'm arguing that economic development authorities need to pay a lot more attention to the things that make it likely that people will get their needs met. You know, if you're sitting in front of a computer all day, you probably want to have a slightly more lively evening. And it's places where people can get out that seem to be especially important in attracting them. Next slide, please. Skills, of course, are important. They're important not just because universities and other forms of education are good in themselves and create knowledge. also, it's a great way of getting people to come to your place. And quite often when people go to somewhere to study, they meet someone, and then unless their courses are exactly at the same time, they get encouraged to stay in the same place afterwards. So you get a double benefit. If you have a really world-class academic offering, you'll attract people, and many of them will stay, which gives you a labour force to start off with. Next slide, please. Startups is helpful, and you don't actually need to have government encouragement to set up coffee houses. They set themselves up. But it's nice to have the space where they can set up. Next slide, please. Has it moved? Cheap accommodation works. Thank you, Michael. Cheap accommodation is also helpful. And whereas when the city was king, the characteristic mode of transport was a Porsche, a red one probably. In the flat white economy, the characteristic modes of transport are buses and cycling. And people spend nearly as much as you could spend on a second-hand Porsche buying really fancy cycles. So again, you have to think about tailoring your city to the sorts of people that you're trying to attract. Next slide, please. Arts and culture. And I don't mean the Royal Opera House, I'm afraid. I mean, I'm an opera fan, but most of the flat white economy are less enthusiastic. When they say music, they don't mean what I think of as music. They mean bands and things like that, things you can dance to, etc. Museums have an impact. Public art also seems to have an impact. You can just keep on looking through and seeing what are the sorts of things that work and what are the sorts of things that don't work. Next slide, please. Interesting that one of the US's most successful flat white economies is Nashville, Tennessee, which of course has its background in music. East London, it was film production and arts. Brighton, well, you know, it's quite a fun city if you like that kind of music. I don't myself, but you know, we're not dealing with trying to attract people like me. What we're dealing with is trying to attract people who are young and talented and creative. And I don't think I fall into any of those categories, certainly not the first. Next slide, please. We've done some econometrics in the US. We've correlated population growth with education and cultural ranking. The straight line, or the straight dotted line, looks a bit suspicious to me, but there is a pretty strong correlation between the places of fastest population growth, the cities of fastest population growth in the US, which typically are those that have developed a knowledge economy. And in this slide shows the role of arts and culture, where they're rated in the surveys of the quality of life. And Seattle particularly comes up at the top, but San Jose, the heart of Silicon Valley, also the same thing. Next slide, please. But education also, the line is flatter, but still very positive. As I said, you get a double advantage. Next slide, please. I'll just dwell a few seconds on social cohesion. We haven't got much longer to go, but I'll just be very quick. My book, The Inequality Paradox, looks at the rather problematic relationship between modern knowledge industries and inequality. And the combination of globalization and the knowledge economy have actually tended to increase inequality. But most of the people who work in the sector are quite committed to social cohesion. They don't like to see the duality of life where you've got one lot of people really rich and another lot of people on the breadline or worse. And it is complicated because knowledge investors are deterred by aggressive tax regimes. But I think you can't actually make a knowledge city work unless you have a very positive policy towards trying to deal with inequality, what I call the excesses of capitalism, and also the people who can't cope, because this isn't going to provide the right sort of job for everyone. There are going to be some people who are left out. And the sort of people who work in this sector do feel very strongly that something needs to be done for those left behind. Next slide, please. Now, how can you use it? Well, you can use this approach in a whole series of different ways. I think it should be the key tool when trying to look at urban regeneration. I also think it makes quite a lot of difference to your transport planning. It helps with local economic strategies. You can use this as an evaluation tool. We bid for and didn't get the Birmingham Commonwealth Games evaluation. And our pitch there was that you shouldn't just measure the success of the Commonwealth Games by whether they attract visitors or not. What you have to measure it by is whether people think it would be a nice place to live. And Birmingham's actually got a lot to offer. It's no longer just, Britain's Detroit. It's moved on from there. And I think it's so important when you're trying to showcase a region that you can show how it would be a nice place for people to live, where they might get their needs met. Next slide, please. So we've got a poll. We've got another poll, and the questions are the same. And the thing that we're most interested in is whether people's minds are the same or whether they've changed.
Great. So I've just launched that poll, folks. As ever, Doug, very fast off the mark here. Well over 40% have already made up their minds. 50%. Climbing. I'm going to close that poll in just a second, so do get your votes in. Okay, and with most of the audience having voted, well over most of the audience, I'm now closing that and sharing those results. And basically, what you did was to shift an equal percentage much more strongly towards streamlined and cheap visas, which I think is probably a very, very interesting bit. But world-class universities still very much up there, and music venues and art centers, and we've kind of given up on tax relief.
Well, I think in that case, thank you so much for listening, because I think I may have converted some of you. So, I mean, I feel very pleased about that. I appreciate that the time you've given up to attend this, and I'd be delighted to take questions. And if you've got a question, which is a bit too technical for me to answer on screen, as it were, please email me.
Great. And as I said, all those questions and comments will be sent to Doug with your email, so just type it in directly into the chat. Doug, thank you. And Doug has kindly called together a number of examples of his work, which I'll scroll through while we're chatting. But to kind of get to the subject at hand, Hugh Purser completely agrees with you, Doug, applauds your opening remarks and says that people and skills are the foundation of Singapore's success as a knowledge city. Bob McDowell goes on, though. He's curious, what's the connection with history or legacy in your creative world? Where does history or legacy fit, if at all?
Wow, that's from left field. I mean, first of all, I once had a chat with Lee Kuan Yew where he claimed that his aim was to turn Singapore into the most highly paid contract labor force in the world. I think you could probably say he succeeded. So Singapore is fascinating. As you probably know, I was brought up in the Far East, and I've watched Singapore develop from when most people didn't have enough to eat to where it is today. And it's just an amazing story. And it's probably the prime example of urban economic development in the entire world. And yet, there really is an interesting issue. I don't think they would like my presentation because of the emphasis I put on freedom of expression. But there we are. Now, what is the role of history? Well, Singapore is actually working very hard to try and create its history, which is a complicated one because it's a history of colonialism and to a certain extent repression. And they're not getting rid of their statues, they're actually celebrating them. And they're just saying, this is our history, warts and all. And I think that having a sense of history is important. It tells you who you are. And also it can link what you're doing today with what happened in the past. I often feel that one of Churchill's great successes as a war leader is he put fighting the war in the context of the past, Agincourt, Cressy, the things that people have brought up with in their history books. And I think somehow it makes people feel more connected, particularly if you're from a different culture, because it gives you something to relate to. But I mean, obviously we are dealing with the industries of the future, not just the industries of the past.
Now, one of the things that I find interesting is you noting the political implications of this, both as an enabling factor, but also probably the tensions it raises. Doug Andrews says 2016 was a landmark year for the creation of barriers to immigration with the election of Trump and the Brexit referendum. Now, the new administration in Washington is starting to revert to prior pro-immigration policies, but in Doug's opinion, Britain has not. What do you think the impact of these policies will be in the respective economic performance of the US and the UK within the next few years?
I think the jury is still out on what the actual changes are in the United States, but certainly some of the more offensive images to do with the Trump administration's barriers to entry have been taken down, and that, I'm sure, is helpful. Looking at the UK, I actually voted for Brexit, which may surprise you given what I've just said. But I voted for an open and liberal Brexit. And I think the jury is still out on whether we get an open and liberal Brexit. Unfortunately, the control of immigration in the UK is in the hands of the Home Office, which seems to manage to combine ineffectiveness with offensiveness. They treat the wrong people really badly, and they make the right people pay through the nose and take ages to queue up and so on. What I would do if I was running the Home Office is turn the thing completely on its head, and I'd be pretty ruthless with some people. There are some people who are people smugglers and so on who are basically taking advantage of the UK. But I'd be very supportive of what I think of as genuine migrants, and particularly economic migrants, who've got talents and skills to offer. My colleagues produced a report fairly recently where we looked at this, and what we actually found the biggest category, and probably the most important category for the flat white economy, was people who come to London. We're talking about the London case, just as a result of almost chance, or because they think it might be a fun place to be for a little while. And then they meet someone, and then they get a job, and then they stay. And I think with immigration, what you have to do is make your place exciting. It's a real privilege to have people want to come to your country. We should never forget this. The fact that Britain is attractive to lots of people around the world isn't something we should be ashamed of. We may have to regulate it, I accept the fact. But what we should do is always be grateful that there are people who are prepared to give up their lives in somewhere where they're used to and come and share our culture. That is something we should be quite proud of.
Well, you remind me, I remember once doing some counseling on a police force and pointing out that if we change their targets to getting the right people who are visiting to the right desks at the right time, it would change the culture as opposed to keeping out the baddies. And that had a profound effect. And I would love to have the Home Office be charged with getting the right people into the country at the right time to do the right jobs, as opposed to putting the wall out and saying who can scramble over it. But that's probably for another day. We've got some really good questions and comments here. One from Mark Heath. How do you see the impact of working from home on the importance of placemaking as a central venue to work?
Really good question, and thank you for that. Two things. One, I don't think the flat white economy, although you might think of it as something digital and therefore something can be done from home, actually works if everyone stays at home all the time. because what I see as central to the flat white economy is that you make the place somewhere where people want to live. And London during lockdown was a miserable place because it lost its joie de vivre, it lost its sort of spirit. And let's hope it will come back fully. I do think that the working at home environment creates some opportunities as well as creating some costs. In our office, for example, we've decided that we will have a party day every month, and we will try and bring people in. There's no doubt that particularly younger workers lose out from not having colleagues around them who they can chat with and pick things up. They also lose out from the social aspect of office work. Offices are not just places to work. They're places where we spend our time and places where we make our friends. And they are so important. It's so important that you have the right attitude there. But I've had discussions with your friend Michael Cameron, Belev, and his theme is that e-passports and the opportunity to expand the flat white economy to people who aren't actually living in London creates a huge new opportunity. And the fundamental task is going to, in the flat white economy as it becomes more mature, is going to be for employers getting value for money. So I think we should be seeing it as net an advantage and looking at ways of bringing people in remotely and connecting them. And also an opportunity of tailoring working conditions to provide better work-life balance so that people can help retain staff. I think we just have to put up with the negative effects and try and mitigate those where we can and try and gain from the positive effects. Because what I can say is that working from home isn't going to go away.
John Patterson is curious, what recommendations do you have for cities such as Liverpool and Manchester, but also internationally, which may be competing with one another because of their geographic proximity?
Well, Liverpool and Manchester aren't just competing for geographic proximity, they're also competing in the Football League. I would obviously take advantage, and this goes back to the question about history. I mean, one of the things that makes Liverpool and Manchester much more interesting to people is their soccer clubs. And if I were trying to promote them, I would try and use that as a huge advantage. You know, come and live, well, I'm a United fan, but come and live at the home of Manchester City. Manchester City is actually within the city of Manchester, whereas United is, of course, not. I think you have to take your advantages where you've got them. Manchester particularly, but also Liverpool, got pretty good universities. Too many of the jobs in Liverpool are publicly subsidized and probably would not be sustained if there wasn't so much financial assistance going to the city. The city does need to attract more knowledge industries. It's starting to, because the accommodation is quite cheap. But in fact, when we were looking at the prospects for building a flat white economy, Liverpool and Manchester both came very close to the top because they've got decent education. They've actually got, both of them got decent music scene. And Liverpool has moved on from the Beatles. And they've got really cheap accommodation. And if there's one thing that attracts students other than academic quality, it's the quality of life you can live. When you're a student, you're not rich. And so your rent is a very high part of your cost of living. If you can get the rent down, you can have a hell of a lot more fun. So these places actually have something to sell.
As we're talking about the North, and we're here on a slide of your transport evaluations as a firm, Mark Cook would like to know, do you have a view on HS2?
Well, I have to be slightly careful because my head of transport has a different view from me. What we both agree on is if there is an HS2, it has to be made value for money. Otherwise, we diverge. He thinks it can be a much bigger regeneration tool than I think. And let's face it, transport and regeneration are not, they are linked, but the relationship is often an obscure one, and sometimes even a perverse one. if you make it easier for people from the north to get to London, they may actually find it easier to work in London, for example, rather than regenerate their own area. Anyway, whether we like it or not, I find it hard to see it being cancelled now. They've spent so much money, and although economics talks about sunk costs, and you should never be misled by thinking that because you've spent a lot of money, you have to go and spend more money. I think the sort of psychological element of it means it's going to be very hard to stop it.
And Mark Heath is curious, should Freeports focus less on tariff exemptions and more on building a wider flat white economy as well?
No. Freeports, I think, are part of modern manufacturing. I think Freeports are about the fact that in the past, big manufacturing units were best placed in towns because manufacturing was all about labor. Now, the thing about modern manufacturing is that the labor content is tiny. I saw a study the other day about the average Japanese factory in North Carolina, and it's employed only 75 people. The jobs generated is, of course, an entirely different order of magnitude. But the point about Freeports is it's what I call the Ford syndrome. I don't know if you've ever looked at where Ford plants around the world are. They're all on rivers. And the iron ore goes in one end and the car comes out the other end. And the thing about Freeports is the easiest way to transport raw materials is by boat. It's the most environmentally efficient way and it's the most economically efficient way. And what Freeports are is about manufacturing and making it possible for you to manufacture close to a transport hub, which basically means you can bring your raw materials in, which are much more critical now than ever. You can bring your raw materials in by sea. And I think that's the way we should look at Freeports. The raw materials are now the key ingredient, not the labor. So I see the Freeports as the counter to the flat white economy. We need to develop both, but one is labor intensive and the other is capital and raw materials intensive. And you need different approaches for the different productive techniques.
Now, you emphasize, and I think quite rightly, cohesion, a low tolerance of inequality, and a few other things. I've got a couple of comments here. Bob McDowell is social norms and standards change generationally, and thus social cohesion has to change and adapt over time. We've obviously had issues to do with terrorism, where we've seen a very different approach between the French and the British systems on cohesion of communities. And yet we've also got some tensions about trying to keep London's population sort of under control, which implies indeed that people need to leave and exit as well. And Bob says, creative people have limited and arguably unsustained staying power. Who takes over when they get off the bus? So any thoughts on that? I mean, in particular, I think there's an intriguing element in the debates that were going on about universal benefit up until sort of the Swiss vote a couple of years ago. And then suddenly we had furlough, which seemed to be a great, we're all in it together and trying to sustain people. So thoughts on where social cohesion might be going, and how do we get people appropriately to leave if we're to try and keep a vibrant community without growing the size of the population?
I think in a population that's generally growing, we're going to find that there will be some growth in cities. So I don't think we can just aim at stagnation. But there is a sort of life cycle to this. I mean, what we've found with the flat white economy is that once people start having children, they're less comfortable about living in cramped urban flats. They're keener to get out somewhere where they can have a garden. And there is a sort of world, a sort of idealized world, where you join the flat white economy as a knowledge worker. And then either you become a really skilled professional in what you do, or else you move into a more managerial. But as you reach a certain stage, your direct presence is not always quite so necessary, or else you might be appropriate, having developed your, so to speak, London skills, to seed a new venture elsewhere. And places like Glasgow, Birmingham, Manchester, a lot of the people who've made their flat white economies take off are people who actually were once working in London. And of course, it can even promote rural working, because some of the people at a certain stage in a flat white economy work no longer need to be in urban settings. And by the time you settle down, you don't necessarily see life quite so much in terms of nightclubs and pop music. You may develop different tastes and interests. So I think it's partly a life cycle thing.
Doug, as ever, we run the time and a lot of questions we could discuss, but I'm going to pick one pointed one here from Alan Mayo. London's always been a flat white city since the days of Lloyd's of London and Jonathan's, etc. And the key to economic growth is flexibility and ensuring that UK cities switch into the knowledge sectors of tomorrow. But you'd just like to ask you, people are critical and all of the points there, but what one economic policy measure would you recommend following this thesis?
Psychology. We shouldn't just think in purely economic terms. We should think in psychological terms. And we could think about how to make the place attractive to the people we want.
Okay. Well, I'm thrilled, and I wish we had more time. And sadly, I'm getting a couple of questions popping in as we've run over, which will be sent to you. You've raised something that I've always felt very, very strongly about, and it was pointed out to me, I think initially by Bob McDowell and later others, but we've got something like 40 learned societies within 2 miles of the center of the city. Something like 70 research institutes. People forget that, scientific research institutes, not just finance. And believe it or not, 120 universities and further education establishments. People often forget about some of the overseas arms that are here and things like that. So it's an enormous powerhouse of knowledge, and we could have gone on. I think where AR and VR, augmented reality, virtual reality, are going in terms of bringing in those creative industries. And frankly, I've always tried to point out that programming, even today, is much more akin to a craft than it is to an engineering industry, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. So there's lots that we could have talked about, and I in particular liked your focus on Nashville, a city that I've also watched along with Birmingham, where I used to live, and both of them have exhibited a different trajectory. So there are different ways that you can do this, which I think is very encouraging. There's no one right way to do it, but I'm hoping in some way we can figure out how to make London be the global coffee shop. That's the one that I want to own. Anyway, Doug, if I could, 3 quick rounds of thanks. Firstly, to our sponsors as ever. They're very, very tolerant in letting us range so widely and freely. And we hope to have you back to develop this thesis, because I think there's much more depth in it than people take into account when they hear, it's a marketing spiel about coffee. I would also like to thank the audience. As ever, you've been really kind in terms of your comments and questions. As ever, we've got an exciting program ahead. Tomorrow, we're having dialing in from Paris, Emmanuel Antman, who's going to be looking at what COVID-19 has done to the European mergers and acquisitions scene. And the rest of it, as ever, just go to the website. But my real thanks, of course, have to go to you, Doug, for coming back for a second dose. It is rare, and we're delighted to have you, and hopefully we can entice you back for a third dose. I'm unable to really go ahead and open the floodgates of applause. Our technology has yet to be able to do that efficiently, but I have here my Korean karmic clapper as ever, and I will give you some ersatz applause. Thank you so much for sharing your thinking with us, and there's a subtlety to this that I'm really picking up, and I hope many others are, as we try and figure out how we're going to develop London's future. Thank you.
Thank you very much.